He handed her a suitcase and told her she was ordinary. He told her she had nothing. He told her the world would swallow her whole without him. Vincent Blackwell said all of that with a straight face, and then he walked back inside his mansion and closed the door. 2 years later, he turned on his television and saw her face on national news. Not broken, not begging, standing in front of cameras with a smile that cost him everything. If you've ever been told you were nothing by someone who needed you to stay small, stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The television was on in the corner of Vincent Blackwell's study, volume low, the way he always kept it. Background noise for a man who rarely needed the outside world to tell him anything worth knowing. He was at his desk, reading through a contract that would tie 3 more Chicago City councilmen to his network, a stack of financial summaries bleeding red ink at the margins, a glass of bourbon sitting untouched at his right hand. He hadn't slept well. He hadn't slept well in weeks, though he would not have admitted it to anyone in that building. His empire was bleeding, and the people closest to him were beginning to smell it. He reached for the bourbon, and the television shifted from a commercial into a morning program. He wasn't watching it. Then the host said a name. Evelyn Hartwell. His hand stopped. He looked up. There she was, on the screen, standing straight-backed in front of a display case lined with pastries that glowed under studio lighting, dressed in a cream blouse with her dark hair pulled back, speaking into a microphone with the calm of a woman who had already survived the worst thing that would ever happen to her. The chyron beneath her face read, Evelyn Hartwell, founder, Hartwell Lux. Azimi, Lux Bakery. Named one of America's fastest-growing luxury food brands. Vincent set the bourbon glass down without drinking from it. He sat very still. The host was talking about Evelyn's rise, phrases like extraordinary resilience and built from nothing, floating out of the television speaker like sparks from a fire he hadn't realized was burning. He watched Evelyn smile at the host, measured and real, no performance in it. He watched her answer questions with the ease of a woman who had long since stopped needing anyone else's approval to feel solid in her own skin. He recognized the pearl stud earrings. He had bought them for her 7th wedding anniversary. She was still wearing them. He didn't know what to make of that. Vincent Blackwell had built his reputation on knowing exactly what to make of everything. He turned the television off. He sat alone in his study for 11 minutes. He knew because he watched the clock on the wall without meaning to. And then he stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the iron gate at the front of the property, the one he'd had installed the year after they married because Evelyn had told him she felt exposed in a house that opened to the street. He'd told her she was being dramatic. He'd had the gate installed anyway, 6 months later, without acknowledging why. He pressed 2 fingers to his temple. 2 years. The woman had been gone for 2 years and she had done all of that. He turned back to his desk, picked up his phone, and told Marcus, his head of intelligence, the man who handled every piece of information that flowed through the Blackwell organization, to find out everything there was to know about Hartwell Lux Bakery. Physical locations, financial structure, investors, suppliers, press coverage, everything. Marcus asked no questions. That was what Vincent paid him not to do. Vincent sat back down, pulled the contract toward him, and tried to return to work. He couldn't read a single line of it. 2 years earlier, on a Tuesday morning in March, Vincent had come home from a 10-day trip to Miami that had been scheduled as a business negotiation and had become, by the 4th day, something else entirely. He'd walked into the house at 6 in the morning when the light through the east-facing windows was still gray and thin, and Evelyn had been in the kitchen. She was making coffee. She was wearing an old gray cardigan he had always hated because it made her look, he thought, like she belonged in a different kind of life. She had smiled when she saw him. It was the same smile she always had, open, unhurried, not strategic in any way. He had once found that smile comforting in the early years. Later, it started to feel like proof of everything he suspected, that she was content, that she was not growing, that she had stopped trying to match the version of his life he was still building. He had not kissed her. He had set his bag down on the kitchen counter and said, "We need to talk." The coffee machine was dripping behind her. She turned it off with one hand, keeping her eyes on him. She had always been able to read a room, or read him, faster than he gave her credit for. "You're leaving," she said. It wasn't a question. I've been doing a lot of thinking. You've been gone 10 days. I'm not happy, Evelyn. She didn't flinch. That was what stayed with him later in the weeks after she left. She did not flinch. What does that mean exactly, Vincent? It means I haven't been happy in a long time. In this marriage. With this, he gestured at the kitchen, vaguely, meaning more than the kitchen. This life. She looked at his hand, at the gesture. You're going to need to be more specific. He was. He told her about the woman in Miami. He told her that it hadn't started in Miami, that it had been developing for months, that he hadn't planned it, but that he wasn't going to pretend it wasn't happening. He told her he wanted a divorce. He said it the way he said most things, directly, without padding, because he believed cushioning a verdict was a form of cruelty dressed as kindness. Evelyn set her coffee mug down on the counter. She set it down carefully, like she was concentrating on not breaking it. 9 years, she said. I know how long it's been. You know how long it's been? She looked at him. Her face had gone very still, which was different from calm, different from the stillness of someone who wasn't feeling anything. It was the stillness of someone holding something enormous with both hands. I gave you 9 years, Vincent. I followed you to the city. I left everything I knew. I sat beside you at every dinner, every meeting, every event where you needed someone presentable and loyal and quiet enough not to embarrass you. And you are standing in this kitchen telling me you're not happy. Dude. Evelyn, don't. The word was quiet and final. Don't say my name like you're about to be reasonable about this. He hadn't expected that. He had expected tears. He had expected negotiation, recrimination, the kind of extended emotional reckoning he had prepared himself for and was already tired of. He had not expected her to look at him like he was someone she was seeing clearly for the first time, and finding the picture smaller than she'd imagined. I'm not going to beg you, she said. I'm not asking you to. Good. Because I've spent 9 years trying to be what you needed without ever asking whether any of it was what I needed, and I'm done. She paused. Her jaw tightened. Get your lawyers to draw up the papers. I'll sign them. He had said then, because he was a man who could not let the last word land on someone else's side. You'll be fine, Evelyn. You're resilient. She had looked at him for a long moment. Thank you for telling me that, she said. Now, get out of my kitchen. Top. The morning after the divorce papers were signed, Evelyn left the mansion with one suitcase. She had been entitled to far more. Her attorney, a quiet, meticulous woman named Carol Fitch, who had handled the paperwork in 3 business-like sessions, had told her she could fight for a significant settlement. Vincent's business holdings were tangled enough that a proper forensic accounting could have taken months, and the payout could have been substantial. Evelyn had declined. She told Carol she didn't want anything he had built. She wanted to start with nothing, because nothing was at least honest. Carol had looked at her over the rim of her reading glasses and said, "That's either the most dignified or the most self-destructive thing I've ever heard a client say." Evelyn had smiled. I'll let you know which one it turns out to be. She took a taxi to a motel on the south side of Chicago that cost $63 a night. She had $412 in her personal checking account, money she had accumulated slowly over years from the small household allowances Vincent considered generous, because he measured generosity against what he'd come from rather than what he had. She sat on the edge of the motel bed and looked at the water stain on the ceiling and thought about her options the way she had learned to think about things growing up in Odessa, Texas, where options were generally sparse and self-pity was a luxury nobody could afford for long. She had a suitcase. She had $400. She had the gold bracelet on her left wrist that had belonged to her mother, Diane Hartwell, who had pressed it into Evelyn's hand in a hospital room in Odessa 11 years ago, and said, without theater or sentiment, because Diane was not a woman who did theater or sentiment, "You're going to be fine. You've always known how to keep going. Don't stop now." Evelyn had promised she wouldn't. In the morning, she started looking for work. The first 2 weeks were a study in the specific humiliation of starting over at 37 with no recent employment history, and a resume that listed only the kind of invisible work that doesn't make it onto resumes. Household management, event coordination, community involvement that Vincent's people had polished into charitable appearances. 3 temp agencies turned her down. A hotel front desk position she applied for went to a 22-year-old with a hospitality certificate. She applied to be a cleaner at an office building downtown and got the job, starting at 5:30 in the morning because the supervisor said she seemed like someone who showed up. She showed up. Every morning for 6 weeks before the sun came up, she cleaned floors and emptied trash bins and wiped down glass partitions in a building full of financial advisors who would arrive at 8 and never see her. She wasn't ashamed of it. She was tired, genuinely, bone-deep tired. The kind of tired that came from sleeping badly in a $63 motel room and waking before 4. But she wasn't ashamed. Then the motel raised its rate, and she couldn't cover the difference. And for 2 nights she slept on a bench in Millennium Park, wrapped in a coat that was too light for the weather, her suitcase between her feet, watching the city go dark and come back up again. On the second morning, she walked to a pawn shop on Michigan Avenue to sell the bracelet. She stood outside it for a long time. The bracelet was a thin band of 18-karat gold with a small clasp that had been repaired twice. Her mother had worn it so long that the hinge had weakened from use, and Diane had brought it to the same jeweler in Odessa both times, a man named Gerald, who kept a shop on the main strip and had known Diane since before Evelyn was born. The bracelet was not worth much in dollar terms. It was worth everything in every other sense. Evelyn went inside. The owner was an elderly man named Theodore Whitmore, who had run the shop since the early 90s and had the kind of face that looked like it had witnessed enough of the world to have stopped being surprised by any of it. He examined the bracelet over a jeweler's loupe without commenting on the repair work or the worn clasp. Then he set it down on the glass counter and looked at her. "You don't want to sell this," he said. "I need the money." "That's not what I said." He studied her for a moment, direct and without pity, which she appreciated. "What are you working with right now?" She told him. The job, the motel, the 2 nights on the bench. She told him because he asked directly, and she didn't have the energy to dress it up. Theodore was quiet. Then he said, "I'll give you $300, cash, and I will hold this bracelet. Not sell it, hold it, for as long as it takes you to come back for it. When you can, you bring me the 300 and it's yours again. No interest." Evelyn stared at him. "You don't know me." "No," he agreed, "but you came in here planning to sell the one thing you clearly couldn't stand to sell, and you told me the truth when you didn't have to. I've been doing this a long time." He picked up the bracelet and held it up briefly in the light before setting it in a small tray behind the counter. "You're going to come back for it." She took the money. She found a room in a shared apartment in Pilsen 2 days later. 2 other women, a shared kitchen, a bathroom with mold along the caulking that none of them had the energy to fight. She paid her share of the first month's rent and told herself this was the floor. There was no lower than this. She was wrong about that, but only slightly, and only temporarily. 3 months after the divorce, through a woman she'd met at the office cleaning job, Evelyn learned about a small bakery in Logan Square called Caldwell's that was looking for part-time help. The woman said the owner was older, kind, ran the place alone since her husband passed, and that the work was physical but the atmosphere was nothing like corporate. Evelyn went in on a Wednesday afternoon. Margaret Caldwell was 61 years old, stout-framed and deliberate in her movements, with flour on her apron and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the look of a woman who had built something with her hands and intended to keep it upright as long as she was breathing. The bakery was small, 6 tables in the front, a display case along one wall, the kitchen visible through a pass-through window. It smelled like butter and warm sugar, and something underneath that, something older, that Evelyn couldn't name but recognized from the house she grew up in. From the mornings her mother baked cornbread in a cast-iron skillet, because it stretched further than bread from the store. She stood in the doorway and felt something shift in her chest. Margaret looked her up and down without pretense. "You have any experience in a commercial kitchen?" "No." "Can you learn?" "Yes." "Can you show up when you say you will?" "Yes." Margaret considered her. "I'm not looking for someone who wants to run the place eventually. I'm looking for someone who'll work an honest shift and not make a mess of my kitchen." "That's fine." "You're overdressed for the neighborhood." Evelyn looked down at herself. She was wearing a blazer she'd brought from the mansion, the nicest thing in her suitcase. "I can change." "What's your name?" "Evelyn Hartwell." Margaret studied her for another moment. "All right, Evelyn Hartwell, come back Thursday at 6 in the morning and we'll see how you do." Evelyn came back Thursday at 5:45. 3 weeks later, Margaret slipped on a wet patch of floor near the proofing station, twisted her ankle badly, and sat down hard on the tile floor. Evelyn was the only one there. She helped Margaret up, got her settled in a chair, called for an urgent care appointment, kept the bakery open through the morning rush alone, sold every item in the display case, and had the kitchen cleaned by noon. Margaret, ankle wrapped and elevated on a second chair, watched her work. When it was over, Margaret said, "I'm going to offer you full-time hours and a raise." Evelyn, who was wiping down the display case glass, said, "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to. I'm doing it because I want to." Margaret paused. "Also because I'm 61 and my ankle is not going to get better the way it would have at 40, and I need someone I can trust in my kitchen." It was not a rescue. Evelyn didn't experience it as a rescue. It was more like a door that opened because she had been standing in front of it, consistently, showing up, and eventually the door recognized her. She learned everything Margaret would teach her: how to laminate dough correctly, how to temper chocolate without seizing it, how to read a recipe like a framework rather than a set of rules. She experimented on her days off, spent evenings reading about flavor pairing and pastry technique, asked Margaret questions until Margaret laughed and said she was going to need to start charging tuition. For the first time in a long time, she felt like herself. Then, on a Thursday evening in late September, a man walked into the bakery 30 minutes before closing and ordered a coffee and a slice of the almond tart that was almost sold out. And Margaret, sitting at the counter doing her receipts, looked up and said, "Adrian, I didn't know you were coming home." He was tall, dark-haired, with the particular ease of someone who had spent a lot of time in rooms where they didn't entirely belong and had stopped caring. He set his jacket over a chair and kissed his mother on the cheek and said, "Thought I'd surprise you." Then he looked across the counter at Evelyn with a straightforward, unguarded curiosity that was entirely different from how she had grown accustomed to being looked at. "You must be the one keeping this place running," he said. "I help," Evelyn said. "That's not what she told me on the phone." He nodded at Margaret, who was already back to her receipts with an expression of studied innocence. "She told me you saved the business. I came in during a shift. She'd hurt her ankle. She said you held the whole morning together alone." Evelyn looked at Margaret. Margaret did not look up. "It was one morning," Evelyn said. Adrian Caldwell sat down at the counter, folded his hands around the coffee cup she set in front of him, and said, "Okay." He took a sip, looked at the tart. "This is remarkable." "Your mother's recipe." "Not the way she makes it." He looked at her. "What did you do to it?" She told him about the cardamom, the slight reduction in sugar, the way she'd added a thin layer of apricot preserve beneath the filling to cut the richness. He listened to her the way people listened when they were actually interested, not performing interest, not waiting for a pause to redirect. He listened the way the room itself seemed to lean in. Evelyn noticed it. She noticed it and immediately told herself not to. She had already made one catastrophic decision about a man who looked at her with certainty. She was not in the market for another. But that night, driving home on the train with flowers still on the back of her left hand, she thought about the way he'd said remarkable. Not as a compliment designed to get something, just as a plain observation. The way you'd identify a quality in something you were seeing for the first time and knew you'd think about later. She pressed her palm flat against her knee and looked out the dark window at the city moving past, the lights blurring in the cold glass. Back in the mansion on Lakeshore Drive, Vincent Blackwell was still staring at the blank television screen. He hadn't moved the bourbon glass. He had made 2 phone calls, had a meeting with his financial advisor, and in a silence that stretched on 2 minutes past comfortable, and spent 40 minutes reviewing a report that told him, in 6 different ways, that 3 of his most profitable operations were about to come under scrutiny from a federal task force that hadn't existed 6 months ago. He was surrounded by people who needed him to still be the most powerful man in the room. He sat at the head of a very long table, and he was a man who hadn't once, in the past 2 years, allowed himself to wonder if throwing Evelyn out of his life had been the mistake that started all of this unraveling. He was starting to wonder now. And somewhere across the city, in a small bakery in Logan Square, a woman who had survived far worse than Vincent Blackwell was already building something he would never understand. And the man sitting quietly at the counter, watching her close up the display case with her back straight and her hand steady, was beginning to see exactly what she was becoming. Neither of them knew yet what that would cost. Adrian Caldwell stayed in Chicago longer than he planned. He had told himself, driving in from O'Hare with his single bag in the back seat and the city rebuilding itself around him through the windshield, that this was a 2-week visit. Check on his mother, look at the books. Make sure the bakery wasn't quietly drowning while Margaret pretended everything was fine the way she had pretended everything was fine for the 3 years since his father died. Then he'd go back to Seattle, back to the architectural firm where he'd spent the last 6 years designing other people's spaces while quietly avoiding the question of what he actually wanted his own life to look like. That was the plan. He was still in Chicago 8 weeks later. He told himself it was because of the bakery's financials, which were genuinely precarious. Margaret had been absorbing losses on slow weeks rather than adjusting her pricing, a habit born from the fear that her regulars, many of them elderly and fixed income, would stop coming if the almond tarts went up by $2. He sat with her at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning, the ledger open between them, and walked her through the numbers with the patience of someone who had grown up watching her refuse to be talked down to and knew better than to try. "You're not a charity," he said. "These people have been coming here since before you were in high school, Adrian, and they'll keep coming if you raise the price by $2. You don't know that. I know you're going to have to close the place by March if you don't." Margaret looked at the ledger. She pressed her lips together. "I'll think about it." She didn't think about it. She thought about something else entirely, which Adrian only understood later, when he started paying attention to the way his mother watched Evelyn move through the kitchen, with the particular careful hope of a woman who had noticed something she didn't want to jinx by naming it too soon. Evelyn, for her part, was not paying attention to being watched. She was working. She arrived before 6 every morning, often before Margaret, and by the time the first customers came through the door, she had already proofed the dough, tempered the first batch of chocolate, and restocked the display case with a precision that was starting to give the place a different feel. Not just a neighborhood bakery, but something with an intention behind it. She had begun experimenting with a new recipe she couldn't quite get right, a layered cream cheesecake with a molten center that she'd been turning over in her mind for weeks. She had a specific texture she was after, something she remembered from a dessert her mother used to make from scratch every Christmas. Not a cheesecake exactly, more like a memory of one, dense and warm and slightly sharp at the finish. She got it wrong 11 times. Adrian watched her throw out the 12th attempt on a Thursday night, setting the ceramic ramekin down on the stainless steel counter and staring at it with an expression he was starting to recognize. Not defeat, but the particular controlled frustration of someone who knew they were close and couldn't find the last half inch. "What's wrong with it?" he asked. "The center's not holding. It looks right when it comes out, but by the time it gets to the table, it's fallen." "Have you tried dropping the oven temperature and extending the time?" She looked at him. "Yes." "Adjusted the cream cheese ratio?" "3 times." "What about the water bath?" She was quiet for a moment. "Not deep enough. I've been using 2 inches." "Try 3. She looked back at the ramekin. Then she picked it up and dropped it into the waste bin without ceremony and went back to the mixer. Adrian leaned against the counter and watched her start again. He had learned in 8 weeks not to offer more than she asked for. Not because she was brittle. She was the least brittle person he had met in a long time. But because she was operating on a frequency he didn't want to interrupt. She had a way of working that was total, unhurried, and total at the same time. Like a person who had figured out how to be completely present in a room without filling all the air in it. It was not a quality he associated with people who had everything they needed. It was a quality he associated with people who had learned to be enough for themselves because they'd had no other option. One evening, after the bakery closed and Margaret had gone upstairs to the apartment above the shop, Adrian made coffee and set a cup on the counter beside Evelyn without asking if she wanted it. She picked it up without acknowledging the gesture, which meant she was thinking hard about something. He waited. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Sure." "Why are you still here?" He looked at her. She was looking at the coffee cup, not at him. "The books aren't balanced yet," he said. "The books were balanced 2 weeks ago, and you know it." He didn't answer immediately. She looked up then, and her eyes were direct and tired in equal measure, the eyes of a woman who had stopped having the patience for anything that wasn't straight. "I like Chicago," he said. "You live in Seattle." "I used to like Seattle." She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she looked back at her coffee. "Adrian, I'm going to say something and I need you to hear it without turning it into a conversation. Okay. I'm not in a place where I can. She stopped, started again. I don't know what you think is happening here, but whatever it is, I can't do it right now. I'm not that person yet. I'm not ready to be that person yet. And I'm not going to let something get started and then not be able to finish it, because I'm still. She pressed two fingers against the edge of the counter. I'm still building something. Myself. I don't have room for something I can't control. He was quiet for a moment. I'm not asking you to control anything. I know you're not. That's what makes it complicated. He picked up his own coffee cup, looked at the window, at the dark street outside, at the reflection of the kitchen in the glass. I'm not going anywhere, he said. That's all I'm saying. I'm not in a hurry, and I'm not asking you for anything. I just think you should know that someone sees you. Not as a project, not as a situation, just as you. Evelyn said nothing. The kitchen was very quiet. She nodded once, the smallest possible nod, and turned back to the counter. That night, in her room in Pilsen, she lay on her back with her arm across her eyes and thought about 9 years and the specific way a person could be hollowed out so slowly they didn't notice until they were already empty. She thought about the morning in the kitchen when Vincent had said, I'm not happy, in the same tone he used to tell contractors their work wasn't up to standard. She thought about the way she had held the coffee mug carefully so she didn't throw it at his head. She thought about Adrian's face in the kitchen window reflection, the way he'd looked at her like she was something that already made sense to him. She told herself that was dangerous. She had been wrong about a man's eyes before. The woman arrived on a Friday afternoon in October, about 20 minutes before the bakery closed. She was dressed expensively, carrying a bag that cost more than Evelyn's monthly rent, and she came in with the particular energy of someone who had specifically chosen this moment and was enjoying the knowledge of it. Her name was Cassandra Vole, and Evelyn recognized her immediately, the way you recognize a type rather than a person. She had been a fixture in Vincent's social circle, one of the women who floated through his parties on the arms of men with money, sharp-tongued and watchful, performing friendship while cataloging weaknesses. Cassandra stood at the display case and looked it over with the careful condescension of someone pretending to browse. Evelyn, she said, like they were old friends. I almost didn't recognize you. Evelyn was behind the counter. She kept her hands flat on the glass. Cassandra, this is adorable. Cassandra swept her gaze around the bakery. Really, you've done something very cute here. What can I get for you? Cassandra smiled. It was a smile like a paper cut, barely visible until the sting arrived. I'm not here for the pastries. I was nearby and I thought. She shrugged. I heard your name come up recently. In conversation. You know how it is? I don't, actually. What conversation? Vincent's people talk. Word travels. She tilted her head. He's not doing well, financially. I'm sure you've heard. I haven't. I don't pay attention to Vincent's situation. Of course not. Cassandra leaned one hand on the glass case. But you understand, some people find it interesting. The timing. You leave, things start going sideways. Almost like you were the one holding it together. She paused. Or almost like you took something with you when you left. Some people have wondered. Evelyn looked at her steadily. If you have a question, ask it plainly. No question. Cassandra straightened, looked around the bakery again. I just think it's interesting. You show up on television, you're the big success story, and meanwhile the man you spent 9 years with is, well. She let the sentence dissolve. Luck is a funny thing. Some women are born knowing how to land on their feet. Other women, she looked at Evelyn directly. Other women know something about making sure other people don't. The kitchen door opened and Adrian walked out with a tray of equipment he was returning to the shelf. He stopped when he saw the woman at the counter. He read the room in about 2 seconds. Evelyn's hands flat and still on the glass, the rigid line of her shoulders, the particular quality of silence between the two women that had an edge to it. He set the tray down on the nearest table. Can I help you? He said. Not aggressively, just squarely. Cassandra looked at him with the rapid assessment of a woman calibrating. I'm an old acquaintance of Evelyn's. We were just catching up. He moved to stand beside Evelyn behind the counter, not crowding her, just present. Doesn't look like catching up. Cassandra's smile thinned. Evelyn's lucky to have someone so She paused, selecting the word attentive. She doesn't need luck, Adrian said. She built this herself. If you're not buying anything, we're about to close. The silence stretched. Cassandra picked up her bag and adjusted the strap with the unhurried deliberateness of a woman pretending she was the one choosing to leave. It was good to see you, Evelyn. Really. You look... She paused at the door. You look like someone who's working very hard. The bell above the door sounded as she walked out, and then the street swallowed her. Evelyn stood very still. Adrian didn't say anything for a moment. Then, who was that? Someone from my previous life. Evelyn exhaled slowly through her nose. She wasn't asking questions. She was delivering a message. From Vincent? Maybe. Or just for herself. Some people can't stand to see someone they wrote off doing better than expected. She picked up the cloth she'd been using to wipe the counter and resumed what she'd been doing before Cassandra walked in, her movements deliberate and controlled. It doesn't matter. Evelyn. It doesn't matter, Adrian. He watched her for a moment. He didn't push it. But that night, sitting alone in the small office behind the kitchen where he'd been working through vendor invoices, he pulled out his phone and opened the search results he'd been sitting on for a week. A series of business news articles about the Blackwell organization's regulatory troubles, a federal inquiry into two of Vincent's holding companies, a quiet restructuring that sources described as reactive rather than strategic. He read through them with the focused attention of a man trying to understand the shape of something he hadn't yet been told the full story of. Then he put the phone face down on the desk and sat with the particular discomfort of someone who has begun to understand that the situation they've walked into is larger than what's been said out loud. 3 days after Cassandra's visit, Evelyn arrived at the bakery at her usual time to find the front window had been broken overnight. Not shattered, the glass was cracked in a single diagonal line from the upper left corner to the lower right, the way glass cracked when something struck it with moderate force. Nothing was taken. The display case inside was untouched. The door lock was undamaged. It could have been random. Chicago had its share of overnight mischief. She stood on the sidewalk in the early morning cold and looked at the cracked glass and felt something in her stomach that was not quite fear but was adjacent to it. The recognition that she had been seen, that her location had been noted by someone who wanted her to know they knew where to find her. She called the non-emergency police line, filed a report, and had a glass company come out by noon. She did not call Adrian. She did not tell Margaret until the glass was already replaced, and then she told her only so she wouldn't be alarmed if she heard about it from a neighbor. Margaret looked at her over the top of her reading glasses. You think it was deliberate? I think it probably wasn't. Evelyn kept her voice even. Evelyn, I'll handle it. You keep saying that. I'll handle it. You've been handling things alone your whole life, and sometimes... Margaret stopped. She was quiet for a moment. Sometimes handling it alone isn't the same as handling it well. Evelyn said nothing. Margaret took her glasses off and set them on the counter. Has Vincent contacted you? No. His people. Evelyn thought about Cassandra Vole. Indirectly. Maybe. I'm not sure. Margaret absorbed this. Adrian should know. This is not Adrian's problem. He's going to disagree with you about that. Then he can disagree with me when I decide to tell him, which I will do when I decide to, not because you feel like he should know. Evelyn heard the sharpness in her own voice and stopped. She pressed 2 fingers to her forehead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean that the way it came out. Yes, you did, Margaret said, not unkindly. You meant every word of it. You're terrified. I'm not terrified. You're terrified of needing anyone. And I understand why. I do. But fear is not a strategy, sweetheart. Evelyn looked out the front window at the street, at the new glass with its faint smell of fresh putty still in the air, at the ordinary Friday morning moving past in both directions. I know, she said quietly. I know it's not. So, 2 evenings later, Evelyn finally told Adrian the whole story. Not in pieces, the way she had been parceling it out over weeks. A detail here, an implication there. All of it. From Odessa, from her father's absence, and her mother's illness, and the way she had given up a partial scholarship to a state university to stay and take care of Diane in the last 2 years of her life. The bracelet. Chicago. Vincent and the 9 years she had spent in a life that fit her the way a room fits furniture, functionally, with no reference to what the furniture might prefer. The divorce, the park bench, Theodore's shop. Adrian sat at the kitchen table and listened with his hands around a glass of water he didn't drink. She told it straight, without performing emotion, the way she'd learned to tell hard things. Cleanly, because cleaning was what made it bearable. When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Adrian set the glass down. He was looking at the table. "Your mother would be proud of you," he said. Not as a comfort, as a plain statement of fact. The kind that didn't need a response and wasn't asking for one. Evelyn felt something give way behind her sternum. Not collapse, give way, the way a door gives way when you finally stop leaning against it. She pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling for a moment and breathed. She did not cry. She had done her crying, all of it, in a motel room 2 years ago with the blankets pulled up around her shoulders and the television on at low volume so she didn't have to hear herself. But something moved in her chest that she recognized as the specific pain of being known. Not managed, not assessed, not found adequate or wanting, just known, by someone who was asking nothing in return for the knowing. "Thank you," she said. Adrian nodded. They sat in the kitchen in silence for a long time. And it was a good silence, the kind that meant something had been acknowledged that didn't need to be said again. What happened next came from a direction neither of them was watching. Marcus Vane, Vincent's intelligence man, quiet and gray-suited and loyal in the specific way men were loyal when they had their own reasons that had nothing to do with the person they were loyal to, had been watching the bakery for 3 weeks. Not following Evelyn, watching the bakery. There was a distinction, technically, though the effect was the same. He had compiled a report that landed on Vincent's desk on a Wednesday morning. Caldwell's Bakery, Logan Square. Gross revenue trending upward for 11 consecutive months. A new social media presence that had added 14,000 followers in 60 days, an interview request pending from a regional food publication, and evidence of a developing personal relationship between Evelyn Hartwell and one Adrian Caldwell, 38, architect, son of the business owner. Vincent read the report twice. Then he called a meeting with his primary attorney, Gerald Moss, who had managed the Blackwell organization's legal exposure for 9 years, and had the haunted look of a man who knew exactly how much he knew. "The federal task force," Vincent said. "What's their current focus?" Gerald shifted in his chair. "The real estate holding companies, specifically the ones tied to the Portsmouth development, the shell structure we used to—" "I know the structure." "Right." Gerald was quiet for a moment. "Vincent, they're not going to stop at the holding companies. The way they're moving, the people they've been interviewing, they're building towards something larger. How much time? 3 months, possibly 4. Gerald pressed his fingers together on the table. "There's something else." Vincent waited. "They've been asking about Evelyn." The room went very still. Vincent looked at Gerald with the particular flat attention he used when a situation required him to be very careful about his next word. "What about Evelyn?" "Her name has come up in connection with the Portsmouth accounts, specifically the signature period, 2019-2020. She was a signatory on 3 of the household accounts that were used as pass-throughs during that period. She didn't know what those accounts were." "I believe that. The task force may not." Gerald met his gaze. "They may be looking at her as a person of interest, or they may be looking at her as someone who can give them information about you. Either way," he paused. "Either way, you have a problem, and it has her name on it." Vincent stood up from the table. He walked to the window of the office, hands behind his back, and looked out at the city below. At the skyline he had spent 20 years learning to navigate and was now watching rearrange itself into something he didn't recognize. He had thrown Evelyn out of his life with a suitcase and the casual certainty of a man who believed the people around him were replaceable. Now the federal government was about to knock on her door. And the woman he had discarded was standing in a bakery in Logan Square building something real, falling into something real, with no idea that the man she had walked away from had just become the most dangerous thing in her life. Not because he wanted to hurt her, but because the wreckage of what he had built was still falling, and she was still close enough to be buried under. They came on a Tuesday morning, which was the kind of detail that stayed with a person. Not the fact itself, but the ordinariness of the timing. The way a Tuesday felt like it should be immune to the kind of thing that was about to happen. Evelyn had been at the bakery since 5:40. She had the first proofing batch in, the chocolate tempered, the display case restocked. She was standing at the pass-through window writing a supply order when she heard the knock at the front door, not the tentative knock of a customer checking whether they were open yet, but a flat, authoritative knock that had no question in it. Two of them. A man and a woman, both in dark coats, both with the particular stillness of people trained to read rooms before they entered them. The man was tall, with a gray-flecked beard, and the kind of eyes that didn't blink at the rate a normal person's did. The woman was younger, compact, with a leather folder under her arm and a recorder in her jacket pocket that Evelyn noticed because the outline was too rectangular to be a phone. They showed her badges before she asked. Federal, Task Force Division, Financial Crimes. Ms. Hartwell, the woman said, I'm Special Agent Dana Reyes. This is Special Agent Paul Corrigan. We'd like to ask you a few questions if you have a few minutes. Evelyn looked at the badges. She looked at their faces. She felt something cold move through her chest. Not panic. She had lived through enough to know the difference between danger and the feeling of danger. But something adjacent to it, a specific alertness that tightened everything in her body by 2 degrees. About what? She said. About your former husband, Corrigan said. Vincent Blackwell, and some financial accounts connected to the Portsmouth development between 2019 and 2021. The bakery was empty. Margaret wouldn't be down for another hour. Adrian was still at his mother's apartment upstairs, where he'd been staying for the past 3 weeks after deciding, without making an announcement of it, that he was not going back to Seattle. Evelyn stepped back from the door and let them in. She did not offer them coffee. She stood behind the counter with her hands flat on the glass and looked at them across the display case while Corrigan set up the recorder on the nearest table and Reyes opened the leather folder. Ms. Hartwell, Reyes began, are you familiar with a company called Portsmouth Capital Holdings? No. How about Dunmore Residential LLC? No. Blackwell Domestic Services Trust? Evelyn went very still. That was a household account. Vincent's financial manager set it up. I signed the initial documentation because Vincent told me it was for managing household expenses, staff payroll, utilities, maintenance contracts on the properties. Did you review the transactions on that account? I had access to it for household purposes. I used it for household purposes. I wasn't involved in the broader financial management of Vincent's business interests. Corrigan leaned forward slightly. Ms. Hartwell, that account was used as a pass-through for approximately $3.2 million between January 2019 and September 2020. The transfers originated in entities we believe to be connected to activities under federal investigation. Your signature appears on the account documentation, and your name appears as an authorized account holder. Evelyn breathed through her nose. In, out. She kept her hands flat on the glass. I signed household account documentation. I was not informed of any other use of that account. We understand that's your position, Reyes said. Her voice was not unkind, but it was also not warm. It was the voice of someone doing their job cleanly. We're not here to charge you with anything, Ms. Hartwell. We're here to understand the nature of your involvement and, if that involvement was what you've described, to give you an opportunity to cooperate. Cooperate with what? Reyes and Corrigan exchanged a look that lasted less than a second. The kind of look people exchanged when they had already discussed how much to say and in what order. Vincent Blackwell is the target of a federal investigation into money laundering, fraud, and obstruction, Corrigan said. We've been building this case for 14 months. We're at a point where we're making decisions about who is a subject of that investigation and who is a witness. Evelyn looked at him steadily. You're telling me I'm on the edge of that line. We're telling you that line isn't fixed yet. The room was very quiet. Evelyn could hear the proofing oven cycling in the kitchen behind her, the faint mechanical hum of the display case refrigeration, the sound of a bus on the street outside. I want to call an attorney, she said. Of course, Reyes said. She closed the leather folder. We'll give you some time, but Ms. Hartwell, she paused. We'd encourage you not to wait too long. The investigation is moving quickly, and the people who talk to us first are the ones we have the most flexibility with. They left their cards on the counter and walked out. Evelyn stood behind the counter for a long moment without moving. Then she picked up both cards, walked to the kitchen, set them face down on the stainless steel counter, and gripped the edge of the counter with both hands and breathed. In, out, in. She had been a signatory. She had not known. She had signed what Vincent put in front of her because in 9 years of marriage, she had been systematically, patiently trained to trust his financial structures the way you trusted load-bearing walls, without thinking about whether they'd been built correctly, only noticing them when something started to crack. She had not known, but not knowing was not the same as being believed. She called Carol Fitch from the back office. Carol picked up on the second ring and listened without interrupting while Evelyn described the visit, the account names, the dates, the phrase person of interest. When Evelyn finished, there was a silence of about 4 seconds. Carol's thinking silence. Evelyn knew it well. And then Carol said, "Don't speak to them again without me in the room. Don't call Vincent. Don't contact anyone connected to his organization. I'll be there by noon." "Carol," Evelyn, "listen to me. This is manageable. The account documentation alone doesn't establish knowledge, and they know that. They're using you as leverage to get to him. That's what this is." A pause. "But I need you to be straight with me when I get there. Everything, including anything you might have noticed and filed away and told yourself wasn't your business." Evelyn thought about 9 years' worth of things she had noticed and filed away and told herself wasn't her business. About phone calls taken in other rooms, about guests whose names she wasn't given, about envelopes that arrived and were taken directly to Vincent's study without going through the household mail. About a period in 2019 when Vincent's financial manager, a quiet, precise man named Gordon Velt, had come to the house 3 times in 1 week, and each time Vincent had closed the study door, and the conversation had gone for 2 hours. "There are things," she said. "I figured," Carol said. "Noon." She hung up. Evelyn sat in the office chair and looked at the wall for a moment. Then she got up, went back to the kitchen, and finished the supply order she had been writing when the knock came, because the flour and butter still needed to be ordered regardless of what the federal government was doing, and the bakery still had to open, and Margaret still had customers coming, and falling apart in the kitchen was not something Evelyn Hartwell had ever allowed herself the luxury of doing. She was halfway through the order when she heard the kitchen door open. Adrian came in from the stairwell entrance, still in the clothes he'd slept in, running a hand through his hair. He stopped when he saw her face. "What happened?" he said. It wasn't a question. He read her the way he always did. Fast, without trying to, the way some people had a gift for weather. She told him. Flatly, concisely, the way she'd told Carol. The agents, the account. The phrase pass-through. $3.2 million moving through something she had signed her name to without knowing what it actually was. Adrian stood against the wall with his arms crossed and listened. His jaw was set in a way she hadn't seen before. Not anger exactly, but something underneath anger, something older and more controlled. When she finished, he said, "Vincent knew." "Obviously. He put your name on it deliberately." She hadn't said that out loud yet. She had been thinking around it, approaching it from different angles, looking for the version where it was an oversight, an administrative redundancy, something impersonal and systemic. She had been doing that because acknowledging the alternative meant acknowledging that the man she had spent 9 years of her life with had not only discarded her but had left her exposed deliberately, had used her name as a buffer between himself and federal scrutiny, and had done it knowing exactly what he was doing. "I don't know that for certain," she said. "Evelyn, I don't know it yet. He put your name on a pass-through account for $3 million and then divorced you and threw you out of the house." Adrian's voice was very controlled. "What other explanation are you considering?" She didn't answer. She set the pen down on the supply order and looked at it. "I need to wait until Carol gets here," she said. "I need to know what I actually know before I decide what I believe." Adrian straightened up from the wall. "Okay." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm staying." "Adrian, I'm staying, Evelyn. That's not a discussion." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the particular steadiness of a man who has decided something and sees no reason to negotiate it. "Fine," she said, and turned back to the supply order. Well, Carol Fitch arrived at 11:47 with a paralegal, 2 banker's boxes of prior documentation she'd pulled from the divorce proceedings, and the focused energy of a woman who had spent 30 years watching powerful men use the people around them as shock absorbers. She was 63, silver-haired, with reading glasses on a chain, and a way of moving through a room that made the room smaller. She sat up at the kitchen table, spread the documentation, and spent 40 minutes asking Evelyn questions in the methodical, incremental way of someone constructing a structure from the ground up. Every question building on the last, every answer placed carefully before the next question was introduced. Then Carol stopped. She looked at a document in the banker's box. She set it on the table. It was a page from the Blackwell Domestic Services Trust's initial authorization paperwork, dated January 14, 2019. Evelyn's signature was on line 7. Below it, in the section marked Account Purpose, was the language she had never been shown. Language that described the account's function in terms that had nothing to do with household payroll or property maintenance. Evelyn read it. She read it twice. "I never saw this page," she said. Her voice came out entirely flat. "I know," Carol said. "Your signature is on page 1. This is page 4. The document was structured so that the signature page was presented separately from the functional description pages." She paused. "This is deliberate document structuring. We can prove you were shown only what they wanted you to see." "Who structured it?" "Gordon Velt, Vincent's financial manager." Carol took the page back and slid it into a folder. "Velt has already been interviewed by the task force. He's cooperating." Evelyn looked at her. "What did he say?" Carol was quiet for one beat. It was a beat that told Evelyn something was coming that Carol had been holding back. Velt told them the account structure was Vincent's design, that Vincent specified your name be included on the authorization documentation because... Carol stopped, took her glasses off, set them on the table. Because Vincent believed that if the accounts were ever investigated, a wife's name on the documentation would be treated as evidence of a jointly operated household rather than a criminal enterprise. He believed your name would muddy the structure enough to slow any investigation. The kitchen was absolutely silent. Evelyn sat with that for a long moment. 9 years. She had given him 9 years. She had left her home state, given up the life she might have had spent 9 years in rooms she didn't fully belong in, attending dinners she wasn't invited to participate in, standing beside a man who measured her worth by how invisible she could make herself when invisibility was useful to him. And he had used her invisibility. He had used it deliberately. He had signed her name into his criminal architecture, knowing that if it came apart, the debris would land on her. She became aware that her hands were shaking slightly. She pressed them flat against the table. Adrian was standing in the doorway of the kitchen. He had been there since Carol started talking. He said nothing. "What are my options?" Evelyn said. Carol put her glasses back on. "You cooperate fully with the task force. You give them everything you observed during the marriage. The patterns, the meetings, Gordon Velt, the names you remember, the timeline. Your cooperation, combined with the document structure evidence, makes a compelling case that you were a victim of the scheme rather than a participant." She paused. "It also gives the task force something very valuable. It accelerates the case against Vincent significantly. And if I don't, then you remain in the gray zone. They can't charge you easily, but they can keep you there. Depositions, subpoenas, frozen accounts. They have tools that don't require a conviction to ruin what you're building." Evelyn looked at the table. "You're asking me to testify against Vincent. I'm telling you what protects you." "I know what you're telling me." She looked up. "I need to think." "Evelyn, the window, I need 1 hour." She said it quietly, but in a tone that ended the conversation. Carol nodded. She began restacking the documents. Evelyn went upstairs to the small storage room at the top of the bakery stairs that Margaret used as an overflow space. Boxes of pastry supplies, an old standing fan, a folding chair in the corner. She sat on the folding chair in the dim room and put her face in her hands and stayed there. She was not crying. She was doing what she had always done with the worst things, holding them with both hands, turning them over, looking at every face of them, because the only way she had ever survived anything was by refusing to look away from the exact shape of it. Vincent had used her, not as a consequence of his actions, not accidentally, not as collateral damage in a structure that had grown beyond his control. He had placed her name in that document the way you placed a sandbag in a flood, deliberately, knowing what you were expecting to hold back, knowing what you were sacrificing to protect everything behind it. She had spent 9 years believing that whatever Vincent's failures were as a husband, the coldness, the control, The way he occasionally looked through her like she was a piece of furniture that had wandered slightly out of place. He had at least been honest about his contempt. She had thought his cruelty was impersonal. A man who stopped seeing you was not the same as a man who deliberately aimed at you. She had been wrong. The contempt was not impersonal. He had seen her clearly enough to calculate exactly how useful her ignorance was. He had not discarded her because he stopped seeing her. He had discarded her at exactly the moment her function in the legal architecture was complete, when the accounts were structured and the signatures were in place, and the window of investigation risk had passed its first threshold. She sat with that in the dim storage room for a long time. Then she stood up. She straightened her spine. She pressed 2 fingers against her sternum for a moment, the way her mother used to press her hand against her chest when she was gathering herself. Not prayer, just pressure. Just the physical acknowledgement that something was being held and held and held. She went back downstairs. Carol was at the table. Adrian had moved to the counter, arms crossed, watching her come through the door with the particular attention of someone who has stopped trying to predict what a person is going to do and is simply watching. Evelyn sat down across from Carol. "I'll cooperate," she said. "Full cooperation. Everything I observed, every meeting I can document, every name. Gordon Velt, the Portsmouth timeline, all of it." She paused. "But I want 2 things in writing before I speak to them. First, complete immunity from all accounts and documentation connected to the Blackwell Domestic Services Trust and any related entities. Second," she looked at Carol directly, "the task force leaves this bakery out of it. No subpoenas, no frozen accounts, no disruption to the business. Margaret Caldwell has nothing to do with any of this, and I will not let what Vincent built touch what she built." Carol looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes that might have been respect. "I'll call them this afternoon," Carol said. "Good." Carol began packing her materials. The paralegal packed the banker's boxes. The kitchen began to return to its ordinary proportions. Adrian waited until Carol and the paralegal had gone through to the front of the bakery. Then he looked at Evelyn across the kitchen. "You okay?" he said. She thought about this question seriously, the way it deserved. "No," she said. "But I know what I'm doing. That's enough for right now." He nodded. She turned back toward the counter, picked up the supply order she had put down 3 hours ago, and found the line where she had stopped. She had been in the middle of the flour order. She finished it. Then she picked up the phone and called the supplier, and gave the order in a clear, steady voice. And when she hung up, she stood for a moment in the kitchen of a bakery that was hers in every way that mattered, that no one had given her, that she had built from nothing while the man who thought he had broken her was busy building the trap she was now going to help the federal government spring. She was done being the sandbag. She had just become the flood. And Vincent Blackwell, sitting in his Lakeshore Drive mansion with his financial empire coming apart at every seam, had no idea that the woman he had so carefully used was now the most dangerous person in the entire federal case against him, not because she wanted revenge, but because she had finally decided that protecting herself and protecting Margaret and protecting everything she had built in this kitchen was worth burning down every last thing he had. The immunity agreement took 11 days to negotiate. 11 days during which Evelyn opened the bakery every morning at 6, worked her shift, closed at 7, went home to Pilsen, and lay in the dark listening to the city outside her window, with the particular alertness of a person who knows something large is moving toward them and has decided to stand still rather than run. Carol called every evening with updates. The task force was reviewing her offer. The task force wanted additional documentation. The task force needed to confer with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Evelyn listened, answered questions when she had answers, and went back to work. She did not tell Margaret what was happening. Not the full shape of it. Margaret knew enough. That federal agents had come, that Carol Fitch was involved, that it had something to do with Vincent's business and Evelyn's name appearing in places it shouldn't have. Margaret had absorbed this information with the specific stillness of a woman who had raised a son alone after her husband's heart gave out at 54, who had kept a business running through 3 recessions and a pandemic, and who had long since stopped being surprised by the ways powerful men used the people closest to them as materials. She had said once, on the 5th evening after the agent's visit, while they were closing up together and the street outside had gone quiet, "Whatever you need to do it. This bakery will still be here." Evelyn had looked at her. "I mean it," Margaret said. "You didn't start from nothing to lose it to him. Not now. That was all either of them said about it. Adrian handled the rest. He had contacts in Chicago's architectural and development world, people who knew the legal and financial landscape of the city's construction sector, and he spent those 11 days quietly building a secondary picture of the Portsmouth development. Who had known what? Which contractors had been paid through which entities? Which city officials had signatures on approvals that shouldn't have moved as fast as they did? He gave Carol everything he found. He didn't ask Evelyn's permission before he started doing it, and she didn't ask him to stop. On the 12th day, Carol called at 7 in the morning. They accepted, she said, full immunity on all accounts and related entities. The bakery is protected. No subpoenas, no asset inquiries, nothing. In exchange, you give a full recorded statement and you agree to be available for testimony if the case goes to trial. Evelyn was standing in the bakery kitchen, flour on her left forearm, the morning's first batch cooling on the rack behind her. When? She said. 2 days. Federal building downtown, 9 a.m. I'll be with you the entire time. Fine. She hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then she turned back to the cooling rack and began checking the batch by touch. The particular firmness of a properly rested pastry shell, the spring back that told her the texture was right. Her hands were steady. She noted that they were steady. She had expected something else, some physical acknowledgement of the magnitude of what she had just agreed to. Instead, there was only the ordinary morning, the kitchen smell, the weight of the rack under her hands. She had made the decision 11 days ago. This was just the paperwork catching up. What she didn't know, and what Carol hadn't yet told her because Carol hadn't yet been told, was that Marcus Vane had been watching the federal building's visitor logs through a contact inside the city licensing office. A small corruption running parallel to the larger one, the kind of thing that sustained itself on the bureaucratic margins of a criminal organization. Marcus had been watching for Evelyn's name for 2 weeks. He saw it the morning the immunity agreement was finalized. He called Vincent. Vincent was in his study on Lakeshore Drive, at the same desk where he had watched Evelyn on television 6 weeks ago. He looked worse than he had then, thinner in the face, with the specific haggardness of a man who had been sleeping badly for months and medicating it with bourbon that was no longer doing the job. He had been through 2 meetings with his own attorneys in the past week that had ended in a silence he recognized as the silence of men preparing him for an outcome rather than fighting toward a better one. He listened to Marcus without speaking. When Marcus finished, Vincent set the phone on the desk. He sat there for a long time. Evelyn was going to walk into a federal building in 2 days and tell them everything she had seen and heard and filed away in 9 years of marriage. She was going to give them the timeline, the names, the meetings she had not been included in, but had been present enough to observe. She had perfect recall. He knew that about her, had always known it, had relied on it at dinner parties when he needed someone to remember exactly what had been said by which person at which moment. He had considered it a useful quality in a wife. He understood now, with the specific clarity of a man watching a structure he built come apart, that he had miscalculated badly. He had used her name to slow an investigation. He had not adequately considered what she might do if she found out. He had not adequately considered Evelyn at all. He picked up the phone again. He did not call Marcus back. He did not call his attorneys. He called the direct number for the Caldwell Bakery on Logan Square and listened to it ring 4 times before it was answered. Not by Evelyn, but by Margaret, who said Caldwell's, in the flat, businesslike tone of someone who answered their own phone without ceremony. Margaret, he said, I need to speak with Evelyn. A silence, then, she's not available. It's important. I'm sure it is. Margaret's voice was entirely without warmth, the voice of a woman who knew exactly who she was talking to and had decided how much courtesy he was owed. She'll call you if she decides she wants to. Tell her... He stopped. He had been about to say something that would have sounded, even to himself, like a threat dressed as a warning. He recalibrated. Tell her I'd like to talk before things go any further. I'll pass that along, Margaret said. The line went dead. Margaret set the phone down on the counter and looked at it for a moment. Then she went to the kitchen, where Evelyn was working the afternoon prep, and said simply, Vincent just called, said he wants to talk before things go further. Evelyn didn't stop what she was doing. I heard you tell him I wasn't available. You did. Thank you. Evelyn? Margaret waited until she turned around. He sounded like a man who's figured out he's losing. He is losing. Cornered men do things. Margaret said it plainly without theater. I want you to be careful. Evelyn looked at her. I'm always careful. You're always capable. That's different. Adrian appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had been in the back office. From the set of his shoulders, Evelyn understood he had heard the conversation. We need to talk, he said. They talked in the back office, door closed, the sounds of the kitchen muffled behind them. Adrian had been on his phone for the past hour. She could tell from the way he stood, the deliberate looseness of someone who had been tense for an extended period and was managing it consciously. He told her what he'd found, Marcus Vane. The city licensing office contact, the visitor log access. He had gotten it from a former colleague who moved in Chicago development circles and had reason to know how Vincent's intelligence operation worked at the margins. He knows you signed the immunity agreement, Adrian said. Evelyn absorbed this. When did he find out? This morning, probably within hours of Carol's call. She calculated the timeline. The call at 7. It was now 2:15 in the afternoon. 7 hours for Vincent to know, to think, and to decide what to do with the information. What does he do with it, she said. Not a question, more a way of thinking out loud. He has two options. Adrian leaned against the desk. He lawyers up harder and tries to argue you were more involved than you're claiming, tries to flip the narrative, make you look like a participant who's cooperating to save herself. Or, he paused, or he comes at you directly, tries to get you to withdraw. He can't intimidate me into withdrawing. He might not try intimidation. Adrian looked at her. He knows you. He spent 9 years figuring out how you work. He knows you don't respond to pressure. You dig in when someone applies pressure. So he wouldn't push. A pause. He'd pull. She understood what Adrian meant. Vincent would not threaten. He would appeal. He would come in through the side door the way he had always come in through the side door, not with force, but with the specific leverage of shared history, of the version of himself he was capable of performing when he needed something, the version that had convinced her at 28 that she was loved rather than required. She had been wrong about that for 9 years. She was not going to be wrong about it again. He called the bakery, she said. I know. He'll come in person if I don't respond. I know that too. She looked at Adrian. He looked back at her with the specific steadiness she had come to recognize in him. Not the steadiness of someone who wasn't afraid, but the steadiness of someone who had acknowledged the fear and was functioning alongside it. If he comes here, she began, I'll be here. Adrian, this is not your... Don't, he said quietly. Not harshly. Just a word placed down firmly like an object on a table. Don't tell me it's not my problem. I know it's not my problem. I'm here anyway. That's what I'm choosing. He held her gaze. Let me choose it. She was quiet for a long moment. Okay, she said. Basham. Vincent came the following morning. He came alone, which surprised her. She had expected Marcus or an attorney, or at least the performance of support. Instead, he pushed open the bakery door at 10:47 on a Thursday morning, when the breakfast rush was over and the lunch crowd hadn't yet started, and stood in the entrance in a coat she recognized from 3 years ago, thinner in the face than she remembered, with something in his eyes she had never seen there before and did not immediately have a name for. She was behind the counter. She had seen him through the window coming up the block and had made no movement toward the door and no movement away from it. She had simply stayed where she was, both hands on the counter, and waited. He stood inside the door for a moment, looking at the bakery, the display case, the tables, the small chalkboard menu in Margaret's handwriting, the quality of light through the front window, taking it in the way a person took in something they were encountering for the first time rather than something they expected to find. Then he looked at her. Evelyn, he said. Vincent. He walked to the counter. He did not sit. He stood across the display case from her and looked at her with that thing in his eyes she still hadn't named, and then she named it. Diminishment. Not the diminishment he used to wear like a coat, that managed, calibrated reduction of the people around him. A different kind. The kind that happened to a man from the outside in. I want to talk, he said. I can see that. Not here. Somewhere. Here is fine, she said. Or not at all. Those are your options. He looked at the counter between them. His jaw moved once. I know what you've agreed to do. I assumed you did. Evelyn? He said her name the way he had said it that morning in the kitchen 2 years ago. The same cadence, the same weight, except now there was something underneath it that hadn't been there before. Something raw. I know what this looks like. The account. Velt statement. I understand how it looks. It doesn't look like anything, Vincent. It is what it is. You don't know that. She looked at him across the glass. I read the page for documentation, the functional description. My attorney has it. She paused. I know exactly what it is. His jaw tightened. I was protecting the organization. You were never supposed to be a sandbag? The word came out quiet and level, and it landed like a flat stone. That's the word for it. You put my name in that document because you needed something between you and the investigation. My name, my signature, my ignorance. She held his gaze. 9 years, and that's what my name was worth to you. Insurance. He said nothing. The bakery was very quiet. The refrigeration case hummed. I built something here, Evelyn said. I built it from nothing. I slept on a park bench with your name on my back, and I got up and I built something that is mine. And you called yesterday because you're about to lose everything and you want me to protect you one more time. She leaned forward slightly on the counter. I'm not going to do that. Evelyn, I testified that I was not aware. I testified accurately. Her voice did not waver. I am not going to withdraw. I'm not going to change my statement. I'm not going to do one single thing that puts this... She made a short gesture that encompassed the bakery, all of it, the display case and the kitchen and the tables and the 2 years she had built it cell by cell at risk to protect you. Vincent looked at her. Something moved across his face that she watched pass like weather. The beginning of an argument, the recognition that the argument would not work, something that might have been the first honest grief he had permitted himself in years. I was wrong, he said. She looked at him. About you. He said it flatly, without the construction of an apology around it, which was somehow worse than if he had performed remorse. I was wrong about what you were, what you could do. He paused. I understood that too late. Yes, she said. You did. The kitchen door opened and Adrian walked through it, carrying a tray of equipment that didn't need to be moved, doing it the same way he had done it the night Cassandra came in, calmly, directly, present without being performative. He set the tray on the nearest table and stood at Evelyn's shoulder behind the counter. Vincent looked at him. Adrian looked back. It was not a hostile look. It was simply a look of absolute clarity. This is where I stand, and I'm not moving. Vincent looked back at Evelyn. Something finished in his expression. The thing he had come in here to try had not worked, and he was intelligent enough to know immediately when something was not working, and he had nothing left behind it. Is this what you want? He said. All of it, the federal case, the testimony. What I want, Evelyn said, is to never have needed it, but I do need it. So yes, it's what I'm going to do. Vincent was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once. The nod of a man who had run out of moves and was acknowledging the board. He turned and walked toward the door. He had his hand on it when Evelyn said, Vincent. He stopped. Didn't turn around. The bracelet in Theodore's shop. She said it to his back. You knew I sold it. Marcus told you, didn't he, in the first weeks after I left? A beat of silence. His shoulders shifted almost imperceptibly. Yes, he said. And you didn't send someone to buy it back. You didn't make sure it was held for me. Another silence. Longer. No, he said. I didn't. She looked at the back of his coat. That's the part I keep coming back to, she said. Not the account. Not the document. That. She paused. You knew what that bracelet was. You knew what it cost me to sell it, and you left it there. He said nothing. Go, she said. He went. The bell above the door sounded. The street absorbed him. The bakery returned to its ordinary proportions. The hum of the refrigeration case, the smell of butter and warm sugar, the light through the front window falling in the same long rectangle across the tile floor it always fell in. Adrian stood beside her without speaking. Evelyn pressed two fingers to her sternum, the way her mother used to. She held the pressure there for a moment. Then she straightened up, rolled her shoulders back, and picked up the cloth she'd been using to wipe down the counter before Vincent walked in. "I need to finish the prep for the afternoon case," she said. "Okay," Adrian said. She went to work. And 2 miles away, in the federal building downtown, a task force attorney was assembling the final documentation package that would be served on the Blackwell organization in 72 hours. A package that included, at its most critical juncture, a 14-page sworn statement from a woman who had signed her name in good faith to a document she was never shown in full, who had rebuilt herself from a park bench to a nationally recognized business, and who had walked into a federal building not for revenge, but for the simple, irreducible reason that she was done being. The 72 hours passed, the way the hardest hours always passed. Not quickly, not slowly, but with a grinding, mechanical consistency that had nothing to do with how a person felt inside them. Evelyn gave her full recorded statement on a Friday morning. She sat across a conference table from Special Agents Reyes and Corrigan and a task force attorney named Solis, who had the particular focused quietness of someone for whom assembling a federal case was not theater, but craft. Carol sat beside her. The recorder was on. The room was beige and fluorescent and had no windows, which Evelyn appreciated. No weather to watch, no city to get distracted by, nothing to look at but the table and the faces across it and the work of saying what she knew. She talked for 4 hours and 17 minutes. She talked about Gordon Velt's 3 visits in 1 week in the winter of 2019, and the way Vincent had come out of the study after the third one with a looseness in his shoulders she had not seen in months. The specific relaxation of a man whose structural problem has been solved. She talked about the names she had heard, not all of them, not with the certainty of someone who had been in the rooms, but with the precision of someone who had stood outside enough closed doors to understand what shapes moved behind them. She talked about the Portsmouth Development Dinner in March of 2020, held at the Lakeshore House, catered, formal, 8 guests whose names she gave in order of seating. She talked about the account documentation, the signature page presented alone, the way Gordon Velt had said just the standard household authorization with the practiced ease of a man who had said it enough times that it had stopped feeling like a lie. She gave them all of it. Not for Vincent, not against him, not in the sense of personal destruction, not with the energy of someone settling a score. She gave it because it was accurate, because Carol had told her the truth, that accuracy was her protection and anything withheld was a vulnerability. And because somewhere in the 4 hours and 17 minutes she understood that this was the last thing she would ever do that had his name on it. After this, she was done. Her name was her own again. Her signature was her own again. She was not his wife, not his alibi, not his sandbag. She was Evelyn Hartwell, and she was going to walk out of this beige fluorescent room and go back to her bakery, and that was going to be the end of it. When it was over, Solis closed his folder and said, "Thank you, Ms. Hartwell. This has been extremely helpful." She nodded. She stood up. She shook hands with Reyes and Corrigan and Solis in turn with the same composed directness she brought to everything, and then she walked out with Carol into the corridor and stood at the elevator and exhaled for what felt like the first full breath she had taken since Tuesday morning. Carol looked at her. "How are you?" "Done," Evelyn said. "I'm done." The elevator opened. They got in. "The indictments will come down within the month," Carol said. "Possibly sooner. Once they do, your name is public as a cooperating witness. There'll be press attention." "I know. You'll want to be prepared for that." "I know, Carol." Carol was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You did the right thing. That matters." Evelyn looked at the elevator doors. "I did the necessary thing. I'll figure out later if that's the same as right." The doors opened. They walked out into the lobby and through the glass doors into the Chicago morning, cold and gray and entirely ordinary, the city moving past on its own business without any acknowledgement of the thing that had just happened in a beige room on the 14th floor. Evelyn breathed the cold air in. She took the train back to Logan Square. The indictments came down in 26 days, not 30. Evelyn heard about them from Carol, who called at 8:15 on a Monday morning while Evelyn was checking the morning's first pastry batch. Vincent Blackwell, charged on 11 counts including money laundering, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice. Gordon Velt, charged separately on 6 counts. His cooperation agreement reducing his exposure, but not eliminating it. 3 city officials whose names Evelyn recognized from the Portsmouth dinner. 2 contractors. A bank officer in the loop, whose name she didn't know, but whose function she understood immediately when Carol described it. She listened to all of it standing in the kitchen with a pot holder in one hand and flour on her left forearm. "And the press," Carol said. "It's already moving. Your name is in the charging documents as a cooperating witness. It'll be in the coverage by noon. Okay?" "Evelyn, I heard you, Carol. It's okay. Thank you." She hung up, set the phone on the counter, looked at the batch in front of her and checked each piece by touch, methodically working her way down the rack. Margaret came in from the front at 8:30 with the newspaper under her arm. An actual newspaper, the print edition, because Margaret had read a print newspaper every morning of her adult life and was not going to stop on account of the internet. She set it on the kitchen table and looked at Evelyn and said nothing. Evelyn looked at the newspaper. Vincent's name was below the fold on the front page, with a photograph taken outside the federal building. Not an arrest photo, an attorney-flanked walkout, the kind that broadcast managed dignity. He looked smaller in the photograph than she remembered him. Not physically, just smaller. "You okay?" Margaret asked. "Yes." Evelyn considered the word. "Actually, yes. Not performing, yes." Margaret nodded. She put the newspaper in the recycling bin without reading the article, which was the most decisive thing Evelyn had ever seen her do, and poured herself a coffee and said, "I'm going to make a call to the food editor at the Tribune. We have a good story, and it's a good week to tell it." Evelyn looked at her. "You're going to pitch the bakery to the Tribune on the same morning the indictment drops." "I'm going to pitch the bakery to the Tribune because it deserves to be covered, and we have been ready for months, and today is a fine day to start." Margaret took a sip of coffee. "You didn't build this place to be a footnote in someone else's legal story. You built it to be its own story. So let's make sure that's the story people read." Evelyn stood in the kitchen and looked at this woman. 61 years old, flour-dusted, matter-of-fact, her ankles still occasionally stiff in cold weather from the fall on the wet kitchen floor that had started everything, and felt something in her chest that was too large and too quiet to name precisely. "Okay," she said. "Good." Margaret set her coffee down. "Get back to work." Bam. The Tribune article ran 3 weeks later. A food journalist named Patricia Wells spent 2 afternoons at the bakery, observed Evelyn working, ate through a significant portion of the display case, and wrote a piece that focused almost entirely on the molten cream cheesecake, which Evelyn had finally gotten right on the 14th attempt, with a 3-inch water bath and a ratio adjustment she had worked out at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, standing in the kitchen alone. The piece ran on a Saturday in the food section with a full-color photograph of the cheesecake under studio lighting, and mentioned Evelyn's background in a single paragraph that described her as someone who had rebuilt her career from nothing and said nothing about Vincent because Evelyn had asked Patricia, directly and without drama, to leave his name out of it. And Patricia, who was a good journalist and understood that the more interesting story was the cheesecake, had agreed. The article generated 412 emails to the bakery contact address in the first 48 hours. It generated a call from a television production company in New York that wanted to discuss a feature segment on Evelyn's entrepreneurial journey for a national morning program. It generated a line out the front door on the following Saturday morning that stretched to the end of the block. Evelyn stood behind the counter on that Saturday morning and looked at the line and felt something she would not have had the vocabulary for 2 years ago because she had not yet needed it. The specific, sober, unperformative satisfaction of a person who has built something real and is watching it be real in front of them. Not triumph, not vindication. Those were too hot, too reactive, too dependent on an audience. This was quieter than that. This was the feeling of a woman who had promised her mother something and was keeping it. She went to Theodore's shop on a Thursday afternoon in December, 3 days before Christmas. She had called ahead. Theodore had answered the phone himself, the way he always did, and had said only, "I'll be here," and hung up. The shop was on Michigan Avenue, tucked between a cell phone repair place and a dry cleaner, the kind of storefront that had resisted the block's gradual gentrification through sheer stubbornness and the fact that Theodore owned the building. The same hand-painted sign in the window, the same bell above the door. Theodore was behind the counter. He looked older than she remembered. 2 years had moved across his face in the way they moved across the faces of people who were already old, making the territory more specific rather than more worn. He looked up when she came in and said nothing immediately, just looked at her the way he had looked at her the first time, direct, without pity, reading something. "You look different," he said finally. "Different how?" "Like you know something you didn't know before." She smiled. It was a real smile, the kind that used the corners of her eyes. "I know a lot of things I didn't know before." "Good things or hard things?" "Both," she said, mostly both at the same time. He studied her for a moment. Then he turned and went to the back of the shop, through the curtain that separated the display area from the storage room. She heard drawers opening and closing. Then he came back through the curtain with a small velvet tray. The bracelet was on it. She looked at it across the glass counter. The thin band of 18-karat gold, the repaired clasp, the particular color of it. Not bright, the gold of a thing that had been worn for years and had taken on a warmth from contact with skin, from use, from being part of a life rather than a display. She had thought, in the abstract, about this moment many times over the past 2 years, had thought about what it would feel like, had expected something large, something that arrived with force. What she felt instead was a quieting, like something that had been vibrating at a frequency she had stopped consciously hearing but had always been there, a kind of tension that had been running through her since the morning she had walked into the shop and set the bracelet on the counter and watched Theodore pick it up, settling into stillness. She took the envelope from her coat pocket and set it on the counter. $300 in cash, which she had taken out of the bakery's account that morning and counted into the envelope herself, because it seemed right to count it herself, to hold each bill and know what it represented. Theodore looked at the envelope. He did not touch it yet. "How long has it been?" he asked. 2 years and 4 months. "You came back." "I told you I would." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up the envelope and set it in the drawer under the counter without counting it, which told her everything about what kind of man Theodore Whitmore was and had always been. He picked up the bracelet with 2 fingers and held it out across the counter. She took it. The weight of it was familiar in a way nothing else had been familiar in 2 years. The specific familiar of something that belonged to someone you loved and had passed through their hands long enough to carry the fact of them in its material. Her mother had worn this bracelet for 30 years. Diane Hartwell had gardened in it and cooked in it and held Evelyn's hand in a hospital room in Odessa in it, and the warmth of all of that was somehow still there, not literally, not in any way that could be measured, but there in the way that mattered. Evelyn fastened it on her left wrist. The clasp caught on the first try. She stood at Theodore's counter for a moment with her left hand resting against the glass, looking at the bracelet. "Thank you," she said. "You did the work," Theodore said. "I just held it for you." She nodded. She pulled her coat sleeve back down over the bracelet and buttoned it. "Come in sometime," she said. "Logan Square, Caldwell's Bakery. I'll give you the cheesecake." He smiled for the first time. A small, deliberate smile, the kind that a man rationed because he'd learned its value. "I don't go to Logan Square much." "Make an exception." She walked out into the December cold. Michigan Avenue was full of the last-minute density of the week before Christmas. Shoppers, delivery trucks, a street musician playing something she didn't recognize on a saxophone at the corner. She stood on the sidewalk and turned her left wrist over and looked at the bracelet for a moment in the gray afternoon light. Then she put her hands in her pockets and started walking toward the train. Adrian proposed in January, not with performance. That was the thing she would think about later. There was no restaurant, no rehearsed speech, no audience. He did it in the kitchen of the bakery on a Wednesday evening after closing, while she was cleaning the proofing station and he was returning equipment to the shelving. And he simply stopped what he was doing and said her name. And when she turned around, he said, "I want to marry you. I'm not in a hurry and there's no timeline. I just want you to know that's what I want." "I shall..." She looked at him across the kitchen. She thought about what she knew now that she hadn't known 2 years ago. She knew what it cost to trust someone. She knew what it cost to stop trusting. She knew the difference between a man who needed her to be manageable and a man who wanted her to be herself. She had learned that difference the hard way, Through 9 years of the first kind and 2 years of slowly, carefully, painfully becoming the second kind's equal. She knew that fear was not a strategy. She set down the cloth she was using and said, "Ask me again in the spring." He looked at her. "I need one more season of this being mine first," she said. "Just mine. Then yes." He held her gaze for a long moment. "Okay," he said. He turned back to the shelving. She turned back to the proofing station. The kitchen settled back into its ordinary rhythm, the hum of machinery and the smell of butter and the sound of Chicago outside the window. In April, on an evening when the trees on the Logan Square block had just come into leaf and the light lasted until nearly 8, he asked her again. She said yes. They married in September in Margaret's backyard, not a large space, 40 by 30 feet of patchy grass and a rose trellis that Margaret had been maintaining since before Adrian was born. 14 people. Carol Fitch came, and Patricia Wells from the Tribune, and 2 of the women Evelyn had shared an apartment with in Pilsen who had become, quietly and without ceremony, her people. Theodore Whitmore came from Michigan Avenue. He ate 2 slices of the molten cream cheesecake and said, after the second one, that it was worth the trip to Logan Square. Margaret cried during the ceremony. Not gracefully. She cried the way practical women cried when they had been holding something for a long time and were finally setting it down, which was with her fist pressed against her mouth and her eyes gone red and her shoulders shaking in a way she made no effort to conceal. Adrian put his arm around her afterward and she said, "I'm fine, stop fussing," which was how Evelyn knew she was fine. Evelyn did not cry. She had done her crying, all of it, in a motel room 2 years and 7 months ago with the television on low. She stood in Margaret's backyard in September light with the bracelet on her left wrist and Adrian's hand in hers and looked at the 14 people around her, not the audience she had once dressed for at Vincent's dinners, not the managed, assessed, performed version of herself she had maintained for 9 years to fit inside someone else's idea of what she should be, but the people who had seen her at the floor and had stayed anyway, or had arrived after the floor, and had seen what she built from it. She felt standing there the exact shape of what her mother had been trying to give her, not the bracelet, not the instruction, the knowledge underneath the instruction that the capacity to keep going was not something that happened to you, not something another person could give you or take from you, but something you either discovered in yourself when the floor gave out or you didn't. And Diane Hartwell had known her daughter well enough to know she would discover it, had known it with the certainty of someone who had lived the same lesson and wanted to save the next woman in the line one step of the journey. She had not been saved. She had found her own way. But she had been loved by a woman who pressed a bracelet into her hand and told her the truth, and that had been enough. Barely enough, some mornings. Enough. Vincent's trial began in February of the following year. Evelyn did not attend. She followed the coverage in the margins of her days, a headline on her phone while she waited for a supply delivery, a summary paragraph in the Tribune that she read over coffee before the bakery opened. She gave her testimony via pre-recorded deposition, which meant she sat in a conference room with Carol and Solis and answered questions for 3 hours and then went back to work. The verdict came on a Thursday. Guilty on 9 of 11 counts. Sentencing set for spring. She heard about it from Carol, who texted 3 words, "Guilty. Call me." She was in the kitchen when the text came. She read it. She set the phone face down on the counter. She stood at the proofing station and looked at the morning's work. The rows of resting pastry, the clean surfaces, the particular orderly readiness of a kitchen between tasks. She did not feel triumph. She had expected not to. What she felt was something more like the final sound of a door that had been closing for a long time. Not a slam, just a soft, complete click. The sound of something being finished. She picked up the phone and called Carol back and listened to the breakdown of the counts, and asked 2 questions and thanked Carol for everything, which she had not said in full before and which Carol received with a silence that meant she understood it was being said in full. Then she hung up and went back to work. The bakery expanded in the spring, not to a second location. That conversation was still a year away. They took on the adjacent retail space, which had been vacant since a clothing boutique moved out, and built a small production kitchen that allowed them to increase volume without compromising the quality of anything in the display case. Adrian designed the renovation, 2 months of blueprints on the kitchen table, measurements, conversations with contractors, arguments about the placement of a single window that he won by being right about the light. They hired 3 people. One of them was a 22-year-old from Pilsen named Rosa, who had exactly the quality Evelyn had recognized in herself when Margaret hired her: a total, unhurried focus in the kitchen, an unwillingness to do anything less than correctly, and the specific hunger of someone who was building something from nothing and intended to build it right. Evelyn trained her personally. On Rosa's 3rd week, she burned a batch of almond tarts. Not badly, not unsalvageably, but enough that the color was off and the texture had lost its spring. She came to Evelyn with the tray, and her jaw set and her shoulders braced, ready for the kind of reception that experience had taught her to expect. Evelyn looked at the tray. She looked at Rosa. "What temperature?" she asked. 350. "The oven runs hot on the right side by about 8 degrees. Did I tell you that?" Rosa blinked. "No? That's on me then." Evelyn took the tray and set it aside and nodded at the equipment. "Start another batch. I'll show you how to read the rack placement." Rosa stood there for a moment, as if verifying that she had heard correctly. "Go," Evelyn said, not harshly. The same word Adrian had used with her once, in the same kitchen, with the same meaning. "I'm not going anywhere." "Start." Rosa went. On a morning in late October, 2 years after the bakery's first Tribune article, a national morning television program ran the segment on Evelyn's entrepreneurial journey. The production company had called and she had said yes, and then ignored it for 3 months before Carol told her to stop leaving things on the table. They filmed for 2 days in the bakery and sent a crew to Pilsen and got a quote from Patricia Wells and found a photograph of Diane Hartwell that Evelyn provided from the shoebox of photographs she'd brought with her in the suitcase. The one photo she owned of her mother in her 20s, standing in front of the house in Odessa with the bracelet on her wrist and a look on her face that was pure, unself-conscious determination. They used the photograph. On the morning the segment aired, Evelyn was in the bakery kitchen at 5:40, the way she was every morning. She had the television on in the corner, volume low. Adrian was upstairs. Margaret was making coffee. The morning was doing what Chicago mornings did in October. Cold, gray, the light coming slowly and without ceremony. The program opened with the photograph of Diane. Evelyn looked up from the proofing station. Her mother's face on the television, the bracelet on her mother's wrist, the house in Odessa behind her. The host said, "This is the story of a woman who was told she had nothing and built something remarkable anyway." Evelyn looked at the screen for a long moment. The image shifted to footage of the bakery, of the display case, of the cheesecake under warm light. The host's voice continued, describing the journey in the shorthand of television: the divorce, the park bench, the bracelet, the bakery, the outline of it, the shape that the story made from the outside. She knew the inside. She knew the motel ceiling. She knew the cold of the park bench through a coat that wasn't warm enough. She knew the weight of Theodore's $300 in her hand and what it had cost to take it. She knew the 11th failed batch and the 13th and what the 14th felt like when the water bath was deep enough and the center finally held. She knew the 4 hours and 17 minutes in a beige fluorescent room, giving away the last thing she'd ever give away that belonged to that chapter. She knew her mother's voice in a hospital room in Odessa, dry and clear and without theater. "You're going to be fine. You've always known how to keep going. Don't stop now." She had not stopped. Margaret came in from the front with her coffee and stood beside Evelyn and looked at the television. On screen, the host was introducing Evelyn herself, the bakery footage giving way to the interview segment, and there was Evelyn in a cream blouse at the display case, speaking into a microphone with the calm of someone who had already survived the worst thing that would happen to her. Margaret put a hand briefly on Evelyn's shoulder. Evelyn put her hand over Margaret's for a moment. One moment, then she dropped it. "I need to get back to the batch," she said. "I know," Margaret said. "I'll watch for both of us." Evelyn turned back to the proofing station. The kitchen smelled like butter and warm sugar, and the particular morning smell of a kitchen that was about to become very busy. The proofing timer read 4 minutes. She watched it count down. On the television behind her, the version of herself that the world was seeing talked about resilience and second chances and what it meant to build something from nothing. In the kitchen, the real version of herself checked the proofing rack by touch, adjusted the placement of 2 pieces at the back that were running slightly uneven, and made a note on the supply list she kept clipped to the station. The timer reached 0. She opened the oven. The heat came out in a wave. She reached in without hesitating, the way you reached into things you had done enough times to no longer fear them, and she pulled the batch out and set it on the cooling rack and looked at each piece in turn. The color, the texture, the springback under her fingertip that told her what she needed to know. Every piece was right. She set the rack on the counter, stripped her oven mitts, and picked up the supply list again. Outside, the Chicago morning was doing what it did. Cold, gray, indifferent, going about its enormous ordinary business without reference to anyone in it. Somewhere across the city, in the Lakeshore Drive mansion, rooms stood empty in the particular hollow way of rooms that had been emptied of the person who gave them meaning. The furniture still there, but the weight gone. Somewhere in a federal facility, a man who had once believed that power was the same thing as permanence was beginning to understand the difference. And in a kitchen in Logan Square, a woman with a gold bracelet on her left wrist and flower on her forearm stood at her cooling rack and did her work. She had kept the promise. Not because someone had made it easy, not because the floor had held, because she had gotten up off the floor every time, in every cold morning when getting up was the only thing left to choose, and she had chosen it. She had built a beautiful life, not because anyone rescued her, because she had learned, finally and completely, that she was the one she had been waiting for.